Thank you. Delighted to be with you all. Where to begin? Let us begin with the cessation of hostilities in Europe. May 7, May 8, the Americans and the Soviets disputed when the war ended. At war's end, there were 6 to 8 million refugees left behind in Germany. Within a month, all the Western Europeans, the French and the British and the Belgian and the American POWs, the Italians, the Russian soldiers, the political prisoners, everybody from the West had gone home. They had hitched rides on army trucks. They had taken railroads. They had been flown home in troop transports. A couple of intrepid men, Dutch prisoners of war, borrowed bicycles and rode home to the Netherlands. There were, however, 1 million refugees left behind in war-torn Germany, a Germany ripped apart, as it should have been, by Soviet bombers from the east, Canadian, American, and British bombers from the west, by Soviet troops from the east, by Allied troops entering from the west. Germany was a disaster, a hobo's jungle, as one journalist called it. There was no food, there was no shelter. The roadways, the railroads, the stations, the public squares had been destroyed. And there were 1 million refugees who either had no homes to return to, like the Jews, or preferred not to return home to their homelands for reasons I will mention. This is the last million. And my book is about them. We Americans, because there were no bombers here, because there was no damage here, we believed that when the war was over and there was dancing in the streets, boom, everything was okay. As a historian and a Jew, I had grown up, grown to maturity, taught that although President Roosevelt and the American Congress did little for the Jews of Europe during the war, did little to save the 6 million. There are debates about whether he was right or wrong to say we will not bomb the tracks to Auschwitz to protect the Hungarian Jews. The only way to protect the survivors is to win the war. In any event, 6 million died. And when the war was over, when the war came to a close, it was my assumption that America, a nation of immigrants, would open its gates, its hearts, its wallets to the survivors, to the Jewish survivors, to the Polish survivors. But that was not the case. Now, who were these last million? Let me just see if I can do this. Okay, can everybody see the screen? I'm assuming.
Yes.
Not if you can see it. You see the photograph? Okay. The first group of the displaced persons, and you see before you some rather healthy looking people. The first group were the Poles. During World War II, during World War II, the Germans, knowing that the war was going to go on for a long time, especially after the Battle of Stalingrad, realized that the only conceivable way that they could win the war was to import, to bring into Germany millions of laborers, forced laborers and slave laborers from Eastern Europe to do the jobs that had to be done, but could no longer be done because the soldiers were in the fields. They needed millions of laborers. And what they did was at first they offered incentives to Polish adolescents. They said, the future is in Germany, come to Germany. We'll feed you, we'll protect you, we'll give you enough wages so that you can send home to your parents. And millions of Polish young people and Ukrainian young people came into Germany, most not because they wanted to, but because they were literally kidnapped by the Germans and brought into Germany. Now, let me just see if I can do this correctly here. These are the first group of Poles, and they are, as you can see, they are lining up because what the Allies do with the last million is they segregate them by nationality, and they put Poles, whether they're Christian or Jewish, together with Poles in camps. And they put Lithuanians, whether they're Jews or Christians, in camps together. This is a group of Polish displaced persons who are awaiting assignment to camps. Okay, now give me a minute here and let me see if I can work this out. Okay, stay with me. Okay, this doesn't seem to be working for me. So we are going to stop the sharing and you're going to have to see my face rather than my photographs in my book. The Poles made up, 500,000 of the last million, okay? There was also another group among the displaced persons who were left behind. The Poles did not want to go home because their country had been devastated, ruined. They had no idea what they were going to find. And they had been frightened by anti-Soviet propaganda and by the reality of Soviet tyranny, so that they didn't want to go home to a Soviet-dominated Poland. The Poles entered Germany in 1940, 1941, the beginning of the war. At the end of the war in 1944, they were joined in Germany by another group of refugees. And these refugees came voluntarily. They were not kidnapped and forced to come into Germany. These were the Latvians, the Lithuanians, the Estonians, and a large number of Ukrainians. And why did they come into Germany? Why did they come into Germany? Because a large number of them, had collaborated in one way or another with the Nazis occupying their nation. And they knew that once the Red Army threw out the Germans, those who had served with the auxiliary police and rounded up Jews and communists, those who had served with the Waffen-SS in special Latvian and Estonian and Ukrainian divisions, those who had done the dirty work for the Germans would be punished. They figured the only safe place for them was Germany. And as the Wehrmacht retreated, they brought with them these collaborators. Now, some of these collaborators were innocent. They had not performed war crimes. They worked in the post office. But they knew that when the Soviets came back, the Soviets' notion of justice was very different from the Western notions of justice. Anyone who had in any way collaborated with the Nazis was an enemy of the people and was going to be punished. So of the last million, there were 140 to 200,000 Baltic refugees. And the last group, among the last million, they're the Jewish survivors. When the camps were opened, Dachau, Bergen-Belsen, Ohrdruf, Buchenwald, when the camps were opened by the Americans and the British, a minority of those in the camps were Jews. They were the frailest, they were the sickest, those who were able to walk, to stand on 2 feet, tried to go back to Poland or Lithuania to see if anyone had survived from their families. There were 30 to 40,000 Jews among the last million. Okay. In the beginning, as I said, they were stuck together with their countrymen. The Lithuanians were stuck together with Lithuanians who had been guards in the concentration camps. The Poles were stuck together with the anti-Semites whose families back in Poland had taken land from the Jews. In the beginning, there were, again, a minority of the last million. 5% maybe were Jews. And then in 1946, the 90% of the Polish Jews who had survived the war were sent home from the Soviet Union. They had survived the war because they had worked at hard labor in the Soviet Union during the war. And now that the war was over, Stalin sent them back to Poland. 200 to 250,000. Again, maybe 90% of the Polish Jews who survived. They came back into Poland to discover that the anti-Semitism was worse than it had ever been. There were pogroms. There was violence. The Polish Jews who went back to their apartment houses knocked on the door. They were told, go away. We thought you were dead. There's no place in Poland for you anymore. The only place where the Polish Jews felt safe was in the land of their murderers in Germany, in the displaced persons camps. What did the Allies do with this last million? Well, they had to feed them. They had to shelter them. So they put them into displaced persons camps, some behind barbed wires, others not behind barbed wires. And in those camps, the Ukrainians built a community in exile. The Estonians, the Lithuanians, the Latvians, the Poles, and the Jews. In July of 1945, 2 months after the war, Harry Truman in the State Department sent a special delegate, special emissary, all the way into Germany to look at the camps. And this emissary, who was a Quaker, his name was Earl Harrison. He had been the dean of law school at University of Pennsylvania. He came back and he told Truman, he said, we are treating the Jews like the Germans treated them, except we're not exterminating them. They need to have their own camps. They need to police their own camps. They need our support. They need extra rations. They need extra medical care. And they need entry to Palestine. Truman immediately got in touch with Dwight David Eisenhower. He said to Eisenhower, do you know what's going on in these camps? Eisenhower, of course, did not, because he had other things to do. He was taking care of Germany. The Americans were occupying Germany and providing food and shelter for millions of displaced Germans, POWs, returning German soldiers. Eisenhower went to visit the camps. And he wrote back to Truman and he said, yes. He said, the Jews need additional help and we will give it to them. With him on his trip into the camps to see what was going on there was George Patton. I'm going to read from you some. George Patton died in an accident before he had a chance to burn his diary. So we know a lot about the post-war period, the immediate post-war period, and Patton's role in it, and thoughts from his diary. Eisenhower goes into a synagogue on Yom Kippur to show his solidarity with the Jewish displaced persons. He visits a Latvian camp and a Polish camp, and he does the same. He says to the displaced persons, we, the American soldiers, will take care of you. In the Jewish camp that he goes into, Patton is by his side. And Patton later writes in his diary, quote, we entered the synagogue, which was packed with the greatest stinking bunch of humanity I have ever seen. The smell was so terrible that I almost fainted. These Jewish DPs, displaced persons, or at least the majority of them, have no sense of human relationships. Eisenhower and the others believe that the displaced person is a human being, which he is not. And this applies particularly to the Jews, who were lower than animals. Eisenhower soon relieved Patton of his command, not simply because of his anti-Semitism, but that had to have played a role. Meanwhile, in the camps from the summer of 1945 through 1946 and through 1947, the last million live in exile. In the Estonian and Latvian and Lithuanian camps and in the Polish camps, in the Ukrainian camps, they set up schools, churches, the Jewish camps, synagogues. They have their own newspapers, their own printing presses. They have cultural events. The Latvians and the Lithuanians are big on dance and choruses and sing-alongs. The Jews are big on boxing. And in all of the Jewish camps, there are boxing tournaments. Each camp puts up its best people, and chess tournaments, of course. Each of the camps fields a soccer team, a football team. And they await what they hope will be a return to their homelands. In the Polish camps, in the Latvian camps, in the Estonian camps, there is a belief that the Americans, who've already beaten the Germans, the Nazis, are now going to go after the Soviet Union. And there's rooting for World War III. Why? Because World War III will liberate Poland and the Polish refugees can go home, and the Latvian and the Estonians. Nobody leaves the camps until Fiorello LaGuardia arrives as the head of the United Nations Rehabilitation Administration, Relief and Rehabilitation Administration. And LaGuardia says, this is nonsense. This is nonsense. And he says to the Polish displaced persons, if you're worried about not having enough to eat because your country has been destroyed, he said, I'll tell you what. He said, those of you who decide to go, we will give you 40 pounds of food. We'll give you new clothes. And when you cross the border into Poland, you can do whatever you want with it. You can sell these clothes, you can sell this food, you can keep it. And a couple 100,000 Poles go back to Poland. Meanwhile, the Polish Jews are coming into Germany from Poland. So the last million is the sum total, but we now have more Jews and fewer Poles. It becomes apparent by 1946 and 1947 that the situation is untenable. The American taxpayer is not going to pay millions and millions and millions of dollars to feed the last million permanently in Germany. The American army says, we're not caretakers, we're not babysitters. You know, we have other things to do. We have to train, you know. Truman and the British under Prime Minister Attlee decide that something has to be done. And if these refugees won't go home again, we'll resettle them somewhere else. The Soviets disagree. The Soviets say very clearly, any displaced person, any Pole or Ukrainian who doesn't want to go home for one of two reasons. Either they're too lazy and they don't want to rebuild their homes, their countries, which have been devastated by war, or they're war criminals. Some of that's true. Not all of it, but some of it. So the Soviets say, we are not paying a penny to feed the last million. We are not cooperating. The Americans and the British form a new organization called the International Refugee Organization, IRO. And they turn to the 30 nations that had been part of the Allied effort. A few of those had sent troops, but many more had simply allied themselves with the Americans and the British. Most of the South American countries, all of the Commonwealth countries. And they say to these countries, we invite you to resettle the displaced persons, to give them homes. And one nation after the other, the Belgians and the French and the British and the South Africans and the Argentinians and the Brazilians and the Mexicans, the Canadians and the Australians send recruiting agents, and they go into all the camps and they give medical exams and all sorts of physical exams, and they interview these people and they pick and choose the people they want to bring to their nations. Every nation after World War II has a labor shortage. The only nation on earth that does not agree to resettle anyone is the United States of America. More about that in a minute. The British, I'll tell you one story that everybody wants the Latvians. Everybody wants the Latvians. They're the first choice. Lithuanians are the second choice. Poles are the third choice. Why? The Latvians the first choice? Well, one, because they're by and large Protestants. They're Caucasians, they're Europeans. And because they had entered Germany as displaced persons in 1944 and 1945, they had not suffered the way the Poles had and the Jews had. They were able-bodied men, women, ready to work. The British were the first to invite the Latvians. The British recognize that the British had a terrible, terrible labor shortage after the war, because they had lost, untold numbers of men during the war. And as soon as the war is over, young people who had previously been at work go back to school, and there is a huge exodus from Britain. British citizens going to South Africa and going to Canada, going to Australia. The British recruit hundreds of Latvian girls to come as what they call the Baltic Swans. And they're brought into England to work as nurses' aides and to work in the tuberculosis sanitarium, where the British don't want to work. And that's such a success that they begin bringing in lots of Latvian men. And they're put to work on the fields, in the factories, in the mines. And it's sometime in 1947, the coal miners, British coal miners, who are to the left of everybody else. There are some communists among them. The British coal miners had been patriotic. They had gone off to war. They had had family members go off to war. The British miners discovered that under the armpits of the Latvians who were working in the mines with them are Waffen-SS tattoos. Every member of the Waffen-SS is given a tattoo, a blood mark tattoo. It's a rite of passage. It's an initiation rite. And when the British miners see these tattoos, they're horrified. They march out and they say, we're not going back. We are not working with men who fought alongside the Nazis. And there was a big meeting held of the representatives of the Coal Board, which runs the mines, the Foreign Office, and the Home Office. And the decision that's made, if it were my decision to make, I would have said no Waffen-SS men will be resettled in the United Kingdom. But that's not the decision that was made. The decision that was made was, we'll keep bringing them in, but we'll make sure they don't work in places where they take off their shirts and people can see their tattoos. In Australia, in Canada, in every nation of the world, former war criminals and collaborators who have, disguised their pasts, and who the labor recruiters don't ask the right questions. And there's no systematic attempt by anybody, any nation, to police those people who were brought in as immigrants to be resettled. Why? Because the war is over. Hitler's dead. Nazis are defeated. Who gives a damn? What's important is not that they were former Nazis, but that they're hardworking Christian Europeans who hate the Soviet Union. And if there's a World War III, they'll be on our side. The one group that is not welcomed anywhere are the Jews. And why? Well, because there's anti-Semitism, but there's also a new form of anti-Semitism. Immediately after the war, there begins to spread, slowly at first, the myth, the big lie of the Judeo-Bolshevik conspiracy. The Pope, after the Russian Revolution, had blamed the Jews for the Russian Revolution. Hitler blamed the Jews for everything. He said, we have to exterminate the Jews because they're subversives. They're against civilization. They're revolutionaries. That myth was kept alive. Now, what about the United States of America? Why? What's going on here? It takes until June of 1948, June of 1948, which is 3 years after the cessation of hostilities. 3 years later, the Americans, finally, the American Congress passes a Displaced Persons Act, which says that the Americans will accept 200,000 displaced persons. And then the law is amended in 1950 to bring in another 200,000. But the law as written in 1948 bars the entry of displaced persons who were not in Germany in 1945. Now, remember I told you the story about the 250,000 Polish Jews who had spent the war in the Soviet Union? They didn't get into the camps in Germany until 1946. So they are kept out. The law is written in such a way to keep out 90% of the Jews. Okay? The Judeo-Bolshevik big lie, conspiracy, the big lie determines American refugee policy in 1948. Let me read you. This is from my book. This is Ed Lee Gossett from Texas, congressman from Texas. And he's referring to the Jews. He says our camps, the camps that the Americans are watching over, our camps are literally filled with bums, criminals, subversive revolutionaries, crackpots, and human wreckage. There can be no doubt, but many of those registered as displaced persons awaiting passage to America have been schooled in subversive activities and seek passage to America to serve foreign ideologies. John Rankin of Mississippi says on the floor of Congress, I believe, he's talking about those who want to pass a Displaced Persons Act. I believe you're getting ready to bring into this country a gang of well-trained communists and representatives of the Comintern who will spread out over this country for the purpose of plotting the overthrow of this government. Dorn, Congressman Dorn, again, on the floor of Congress. I am told that there are more communists in New York City today than there are in the entire country of Holland. Where he gets this figure, he doesn't tell us. No great country was ever destroyed, or at least it seldom happened from without. It was always from within. We cannot let these subversives into our country. Let me conclude by telling what happens to the last million. All but the Jews are resettled in nations across the world. Australia takes in, thousands, tens of thousands. Canada takes in tens of thousands. The South Africans take in tens of thousands. Nobody takes the Jews. When Truman realizes that he cannot get through Congress a bill that will authorize the resettlement of the Jewish survivors, he realizes that he has no choice. No choice. He's got to get the 250,000 Jews out of Germany before he hands over the reins of government to a new West German government, right? Before he does that, he can't possibly give a German government power over 250,000 Jews who were in refugees camps. So what does he do? What does he do? He supports and recognizes the independence of the state of Israel. 3 minutes after Ben Gurion reads the Declaration of Independence, Truman says the United States recognizes the state of Israel. Why does he do this? He does it not simply because he has friends who are Jews, or he reads the Bible, or he's a Zionist. He does it because there is no place else on earth that the Jews are welcome. And here is the ultimate irony. The ultimate irony. 50,000 Jews come to the United States of America as displaced persons. 50,000 displaced persons who are Jewish come to the United States. 150 to 200,000 go to Israel. 1/3 of the soldiers who die in the 1948 war are European displaced persons. 1/3 of the casualties and the soldiers in that war are displaced persons. 150 to 200,000 European Jews, displaced persons, refugees end up in Israel. And where are they housed? They take over apartments, settlements, houses that were once occupied by Palestinians who have fled in 1947 and 1948. So the solution to one displaced person's problem results in a second displaced person's refugee problem that remains with us today. Now, the Jews did not want, it was not their idea to take over homes vacated by Palestinians who the new Israeli government wouldn't let back into the country. It was not their idea. Nonetheless, it is a ironic tragedy that the only place on earth for them was a nation at war in which they were placed in homes vacated by the next generation of refugees. I am happy to take questions.
And David has offered his email, which I'm going to post in the chat too, in case you think of something afterwards that you you want to contact him about. I think a question, David, or a story.
Yeah, you know, one of the wonderful things that's happened after this book, I have given, you know, dozens and dozens of Zooms to groups from 20 people to, you know, 800. And after these events, people get in touch with me and tell me wonderful stories, or identify someone in one of my photos and say, that's my grandfather, you know, that's my aunt. And if anyone has any particular questions or comments or stories, they can, I think, is my email in the chat?
Oh, I'm adding it right now, but I made a typo, so.
Okay, well, I'll give it to you, and it'll also be added to the chat. It's there you go. It's
Thank you.
with an EDU, dnasaw@gc.cuny.edu.
I have a question. Are we putting it in the chat, or are we, how are we doing the questions?
I think if you have one now, that.
Well, oh, right, so.
Yeah, I think we can just ask them as well, right, David?
Sure, fine with me.
Okay. First of all, I really found the book a captivating read. You know, there's so many great things about it, but you know, I just love the way you had primary source quotes that were just woven into the narrative seamlessly. But that's not my question. It struck me as I was reading it that the coded anti-Semitism in the United States, specific politicians during the debate and discussion about these DP bills, where they're framing the bills in order to keep out the Jews, but without using actually anti-Semitic language. But it was clear that, we're going to make sure that we're only taking people that were in Germany by 1945. What they were doing strikes me as being so similar to the kind of politics we're hearing today in red states, where they're trying to, without using racist language, they're trying to fashion laws that won't allow blacks to vote. And it's just very, and you mentioned the big lie. These days I hear the big lie, and I'm definitely thinking Donald Trump and the election and, all this kind of thing. And I'm just wondering, as you're writing this book, did you have half an eye on this weird world we're living in the last couple of years? There's a lot of politics of the 1940s and early 1950s that just seem like we're hearing that kind of thing again.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. Look, one of the things that horrifies me is, as I'm reading these transcripts in Congress, look, Rankin and Gossett didn't want any foreigner to come into this country. They were particularly opposed to the Jews because of the Judeo-Bolshevik conspiracy, the big lie, but they didn't want anybody to come in.
Or this guy Revercombe.
Yeah, Revercombe is a horror. He's the senator from West Virginia, Republican senator from West Virginia. But what goes on is that this nation, in the post-war period, the politicians give in to a politics of fear. And that politics of fear is exacerbated, generated by big lies. And the result is that this nation, I mean, the Canadians, the Australians, they do beautifully because they brought in a wave of smart, wonderful immigrants. And, we keep them out until 1948. And by the time we let them in, hundreds of thousands of Poles and of Latvians and Ukrainians who are not war criminals have resettled in Australia or Canada. So we damage ourselves. We are a nation of immigrants, and it's part of our strength. And to allow big lies and a politics of fear to rule our immigration policy is just it's a tragedy. The other thing is that Americans, certainly in the immediate post-war period, we have no historical memories. The war was over, we wash our hands of it. And from 1945 on, if you were in any way associated with the Soviet Union or Poland, or had anything that could tie you to the Soviet Union and Poland, you were not likely, and a Jew, you were not likely to get a visa to this country. In my book, a friend who wrote a wonderful book, Joseph Berger, who some of you may have recognized, he was a New York Times reporter for years and an editor. I tell this story in my book, and Joe tells it in his book. And when Joe got ready to go to Columbia University journalism school, Columbia University demanded of him a birth certificate. So he's 21 years of age. He goes to his mother and he says, "Mom, where's my birth certificate?" And his mom says, "Joey, I got to tell you a story." His mother turns white and he says, "What's the matter, Mom?" And she says, "Joey, we've lied to you all these years. Your birth certificate is forged. It says you were born in Poland. He said, but you weren't. You were born in the Soviet Union. And Joey says, but why? Why did you lie? Why did you lie to me all these years? His mother says, because we were afraid if anybody knew you were born in the Soviet Union and we had lived in the Soviet Union, we wouldn't get our visas. I read another book by Esther Safran Foer, whose son is Jonathan Foer, the novelist. And she learned years and years later that the birth date on her birth certificate was not her birth date, and that she was not born in Germany, but she was born in Poland. And again, the lie was told because of the fear of the Judeo-Bolshevik conspiracy. If there is one lesson, I hope can be learned from my book, it's that we can't base an immigration policy or a refugee policy on a politics of fear and on big lies. We can't do it. And when Ed Lee Gossett and John Rankin and Revercombe and all the rest passed these lies in Congress, it was incumbent on everybody else who was there and knew these were lies to stand up, and condemn them, whether they were Democrats, whether they were Republicans. It was incumbent on them to do it. And the only ones who consistently stood up against these guys were a couple of Jewish congressmen from New York. Jake Javits was in the Congress at that time, Manny Seller, Adolph Sabath from Chicago, and Claude Pepper from Florida, who soon lost his seat because he was accused of being not enough of an anti-communist.
I have a question, just a small question. Those people who had fled Poland and fled east, and I actually had a friend in graduate school whose family had done that. They had fled Poland, gone east, and then kept going east across Central Asia. And I said, where were you born? He said, somewhere in Central Asia. And they ultimately ended up in Shanghai. And I somehow from there managed to get their way to the United States by, I don't know quite how they did it, but at any rate, did Stalin force them all to leave, or did they leave some of them voluntarily, looking to see if they could go back home again?
Stalin didn't force anybody to leave. Stalin
said, I thought so.
Yeah, Stalin said it's up to you. If you want to go back, I will send. And nobody quite knows why he does it, because this is not yet in Stalin's anti-Semitic period. But he doesn't want, he doesn't want Zionists there. He's not terribly fond of the Jews. So he gives train passage to Poles, Jews and not Jews, to go back to the Soviet Union, to go back from the Soviet Union to Poland. And 80% of them do. Historians are just now beginning to figure this out. It's a great injustice to history. There's so much we don't know about the Holocaust, so much we don't know about the post-war period. When we think about the Holocaust, we think about Auschwitz, but half of the Jews who were killed in Latvia, Lithuania, the Ukraine, parts of Russia, and they were shot to death. They weren't gassed. And those who survived by hiding in homes of neighbors or in the forests or going into the Soviet Union. And we're just beginning, historians are just beginning to unearth and to tell their stories.
I have a small question. This is Sal, if I can.
Please.
Yeah, actually I have two quick questions. One, and you've touched base a few times, but where would you say you were able to garnish the best information in terms of research? And the other quick one, I don't know if I left for a minute, but how come we let folks in 48? You said that we let them in 48.
Yeah.
So those are two quick questions.
Okay, we let them in 48 because finally, after a long period of time, the Catholic Church and the Jewish organizations and labor unions that had large numbers of ethnic members got together and they formed a lobbying group. And the Jews supplied money and expertise, and the Catholic Church organized in the churches to let in the Poles and the Ukrainians. The Jews were a minority. You know, nobody expected that more than a quarter of those 200,000 would be Jews. So it was a united effort in 1948. What no one expected was this frightening betrayal of this coalition by Southern Democrats and Midwestern Republicans who passed this amendment barring the Jews, the Polish Jews. I did my research all over the place. You know, in New York City, there's the Center for Jewish History, the Holocaust Museum, the National Archives in Kew, Great Britain. I had research assistants who were able to translate documents from Hebrew and Yiddish and Russian and Ukrainian. My big biographies that are, 1,000 pages long took me 5 to 6 years. This took me more than 8 years to write because of all the different work I had to do. There are also thousands of testimonies, some of them collected by Steven Spielberg for the Shoah Foundation, others collected by Ukrainian organizations and Latvian organizations of people who lived in the displaced persons camps. And there are hundreds of memoirs. So, the bibliography is a long bibliography. And
That's why I thought I would ask,
Yeah, thank you.
It's incredible.
I've got a question for you, David. I'm particularly interested in this, the treatment of Jews who went back to Poland after the war and the horrific treatment that they suffered at the hands of Polish people there. So I guess a couple of, the one question is, first question is, was that violence governmentally organized, or was it kind of spontaneous mob violence by the local people? And the second question is, I know that Polish people are rightfully, sort of sensitive about this issue and the degree of publicity that's generated behind it. And so I'm trying to understand just really how pervasive it was. You had some specific instances of, I think it was 30 or 35 people who were killed, but is that just a representative moment of a much larger trend, or was that just significant because it was so horrific?
Yeah, there had always been Polish anti-Semitism was not new, but it had always been, it was exacerbated by 4 to 5 years of Nazi occupation. I mean, the Nazis brought with them this virulent anti-Semitism, and it stoked the hatred of Poles. That's number one. Number two, Poland is a frighteningly poor country at this point in time. It is devastated. The Poles lose more railroad track, more livestock, more arable land, more farms, more factories, mines and mills than any other country, save parts of the Soviet Union. The Poles survived in large part by taking over Jewish businesses. Thousands of Poles survived. They got their homes, they got their farmlands, they got their businesses by taking it from the Jews, and they weren't going to give it back. the government, the Polish government, provisional government, which was a coalition government, which was dominated by communists, was not anti-Semitic. It tried to do what it could for the Jews, but it was not strong enough. And the Catholic Church, which could have stepped in, the Catholic Church, which could have stepped in and done something, was as anti-Semitic as the general population. Now, as far as the Poland today, it is true that there were fewer Nazi collaborators in Poland than there were anywhere else in Europe. And that was because the Nazis regarded the Poles as subhuman, and they weren't going to let them collaborate in any way with Aryans. That's number one. But the death camps that were situated in Poland were run by Germans and Ukrainians and some Poles. So to blame the Poles for Auschwitz and Birkenau and Sobibor and all the rest is not correct. On the other hand, the Poles have a lot to account for after the war and during the war. There were good Poles who hid Jews and fed Jews, and there were many, many more anti-Semites. And after the war, the anti-Semitism from 1945 to 1948 was frightening. And it is what is going on in Poland now is frightful, certainly for historians. Because if you dare say anything that implicates a Pole in the genocide, you break the law. And the Poles are trying to rewrite history in a way that I find, loathsome and frightening.
What about the Germans who had settled, who had lived in the East for generations? I mean, the border of Poland and Germany was always, from 1792, and then the millions of them, or the thousands of them who fled east, fled west, but there was all that land to take.
Yeah, they were, what happens after World War II, okay, and after World War II, the map of Europe is changed. There is ethnic cleansing all over Europe. The Ukrainians, nationalists, butcher Poles. Poles leave the Ukraine. Ukrainians leave Poland. And all through Eastern Europe, the Czechs, the Poles, the Yugoslavs, they round up the Volksdeutsch, Germans who had settled in Czechoslovakia or Poland or Hungary for generations or during the war, and they put them on trains and they send them back to Germany. And among them are innocent Germans, but also among them are Nazi collaborators. The Allies do nothing to try to sort out, they're overwhelmed. Germany is one of the reasons why the displaced persons have to be gotten out of Germany, is that Germany is a mess. Germany is a mess. There are millions of Germans from Eastern Europe who have been, again, put in cattle cars when the war is over and sent back to Germany. And they need to be sheltered and they need to be fed. I am going to say goodnight. You've been wonderful. I have enjoyed this immensely. I hope those of you who have not had a chance to read the book get a chance to read it. And those who have read the book, if you have any comments or questions, please get in touch with me. I'd be delighted to continue the conversation with you over email.
Thank you very much, David. Thank you, everybody, for coming.
Thank you.